Today I'm going to show you guys how I recreated the song Oh Caroline by the 1975 off of their new album Being Funny in a Foreign Language. This track has a lot of cool, really 80s inspired production. I'll show you how I replicated their piano sound and how to play MIDI more effectively when you're not really a great piano player, how to layer up 80s style guitars and synths, and how to layer up percussion layers and drums to get that authentic 80s sound. But before we jump into that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a freelance music producer under the name Velvet Year. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to produce their own pop music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you jive with how I produce music and you feel like we might have fun working on a project together, I have a link at the top of my description for artists who want to collaborate with me on something. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the track. So the first thing we're going to look at are these pianos. I would say without a doubt this song is a piano-driven song first, like to the point where everything else kind of feels like it's being mixed around the piano. At least that's how I approached it. Now, I'm not the best piano player in the world. My approach for it has always been a little bit janky, but for me, I feel like it works. So normally what I'll do is I'll play what I would consider to be like the left hand, which is normally like root chords lower on the piano, stuff that's a little bit more grounded. And then what I'll do is I will take that MIDI track with my sustain pedal and all that, and I will take that whole thing and duplicate it down here, and then I'll go into the track and delete all of the MIDI inside of the region. And the reason I do that is because the sustain pedal automation that I've recorded when doing this take, I want it to stay there, because then what I can do is I can record a higher part on the piano using just my right hand, and the sustain pedal will make it feel like it's a single piano performance. So I'll show you what I mean. Here's this guy. All right, very basic piano, and then this other track is the exact same piano patch, exact same sound, exact same everything, only it's just me playing what I would consider to be the right hand. Like the sustain pedal automation is matching this upper performance. So when I put both of them together, they sound like a single piano. So yeah, that's for all my fellow guitar players who need to record piano every once in a while. In terms of actual sound design, I'm using the Addictive Keys Retro Grand for one part of it. So these two are the same sound. And then this upper track is actually all of this MIDI in a single channel. There was some issue where it wasn't working the exact same way. Don't ask me why. But yeah, so essentially this is the exact same thing. Realistically, if you're going to use this technique, I would probably just do it on the same track. But then we have this other Addictive Keys patch, this Your Upright patch, which is super chorusy, super weird, and super 80s. And when you combine the two together, they just feel like this glorious, like 80s retro piano sound. But yeah, I really wanted the whole mix to sort of bounce around these pianos. So what I've done is, besides the drums, everything else in the beat is on this massive group section where I have an instance of track spacer. It's kind of like what I normally use Soothe for, like the subtractive EQ stuff, but it's way more broad. So it's pulling out all this mid-range whenever the pianos are playing, which just makes the track a little bit cleaner. Which, moving on, so let's look at this lead line here. So I absolutely love this sound, and it comes in two parts. First part is this synth layer, which is made up of some Prophets, which, funny enough, is the same synth patch that they use in Africa by Toto, like that dun 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 dun. You can kind of hear it. But yeah, I'm using the Arturia Prophet for this. I messed around with the attack and the portamento. The main reason it has that sort of like wah part to it was just because I added this auto filter on this envelope setting. So if I take it off when I turn it on, so it's a high pass filter, but the envelope is reactively opening every time the signal hits it. And I have that duplicated an octave down. And then I just used some utility here because they were a little bit quiet after I did that. So I just wanted to get them up to a higher level. Blended them together, used some high passing. And then since it was such a vintage track, I decided I was going to try to do a little bit more analog mixing. So I'm just using the SSL 4000 from Plugin Alliance, which I'm having a great time with. And then those synths are being doubled up with these guitars. which are a couple of takes of a Strat, an octave up, an octave down, playing the exact same lead line. I normally turn off the studio reverb just because I like doing my mixing stuff and then going into a reverb on a send. But yeah, they were fluttering a little bit and I got my auto-tune activation back. So I have them. So these very simple lead lines are actually being really auto-tuned. Just set to this instrument preset, retune speed at 10, set to the key of the song, just because they were a little bit pitchy. So if I turn those auto-tunes off, you can hear it on the last note there a lot. And then when I turn them both back on, it feels like they're glued a little bit more. And when you have them next to a synthesizer, it just makes it a little bit tighter. So for mixing these guitars, I've actually gone back to my Schoeps Omni channel, which I forgot how much I love. I would say this is probably the most practical mixing channel strip plugin you can get because it has everything that you would ever need to get the basic sound you would need. And then these little modules, you can sort of drag and drop them wherever you want. So honestly, whenever I'm doing a first pass of a mix, as of late, I just use this on like every channel. Get some general control, some tone shaping. Also, the fact that it has a limiter at the very end makes it awesome. And yeah, by that point, I've got about 70 to 80% of the sound. So yeah, if there's any plugin that you need for like a channel strip stuff, I would highly recommend this one because it has a lot of that vintage color, but it's also like modern enough to where you can like high pass and low pass stuff a little bit more than if you were just using a vintage emulation. Sometimes they add those sort of vintage limitations as well, but this one doesn't, and I love it a lot. After those guitars, we have these synth layers here. For that pad, I'm using acoustic textures in Particles, in Output Arcade. Just this low note here. Transposed it up a couple of octaves. It almost always never fails to be like a really fun, like organic layer working as a pad. And then I'm essentially band passing it. If I was smarter, I would just use one of these guys and just do that. But in the moment, I always forget that that exists. And then I have this little ARPy guy made in Anna 2. Which is this really fun, sort of cheesy 80s lead line. Honestly, with Anna 2, I feel like a lot of the patches that I've been using lately, they don't require a whole lot of tweaking. Maybe I'll turn off some of the delays and reverbs if it just makes the processing a little bit easier. But yeah, some auto filter, and again, some Schoeps Omni channel. Normally, how I'll use this is I'll just start with the default patch and just work my way from left to right, because it's kind of a sensical workflow. You set your high pass filter and any kind of saturation that you want after that. Normally, I don't need to use the gate that often unless I'm doing like vocals or something else like acoustic guitars where there's like a live microphone in the room. Then you have this DS squared, which is like a couple of bands of dynamic EQ, so you can use it to like DS stuff. Normally I'm using a band or two on acoustic guitars. Then you can look at the 4-band EQ, and for this EQ I tend to not do a whole lot of like surgical stuff. I tend to do very broadband stuff. And then you have a compressor here at the end, and you have 3 different kinds of compressor channels, which is awesome because in the moment you can decide, do I want a FET compressor? Do I want an optical compressor? And literally all of these channels, you can hit a window and go a little bit more in depth if you want to tweak it. And then you can add like one more module of like Waves plugins. Only downside is it's only Waves plugins, which makes sense, but still. And then a limiter here at the end, which is awesome for like dynamic control. Then we have a couple of other guitars here, meant to be sort of like little pokey accents in between certain beats. Honestly, I just came up with the piano rhythm, this lead line, and then I'm kind of using these guys to sort of fill in any blank spots that are happening. And one that's panned left, one of them's panned right, and they're pretty different sounds with different reverbs on them, and they're playing stuff that's pretty different. So this one is single note stuff, and then this one's more of like a dirty washed out chord. So having them sort of like bounce back and forth, it just sort of makes the beat interesting. They're using the exact same patch as before, that Prince in the Rain preset with a Schoeps Omni channel. For this track, I wanted to get more of that like pick attack bass, and so I decided I was going to try using a MIDI bass for this. So I used the Contact Scarby Rickenbacker bass, which I thought turned out really well. I passed it and low passed it a little bit just because there was a little bit more pick attack, and this is more of like a vintage bass sound. And then again, Schoeps Omni channel, and this is what I'm talking about here. Like I'm using the dynamic EQ to sort of tame that sort of sub low end, and then also a little bit of that pick attack up here in the higher register. Just makes it a little bit more consistent. And with the bass line in the song, it's very strange. They like don't do anything like on the one. It's like boom, 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 So I tried to sort of replicate that rhythm with it. And now let's look at the drums. We have this sort of like 80s rototom fill going into it. A large part of that sort of 80s sound is coming from this nonlinear reverb that I have on Ascend. Basically, if you want to add an 80s vibe to anything, just throw a nonlinear reverb on Ascend and run your drums through it, because it will definitely give it that flavor. So here we have our kick drum. One more of like a vinyl-y kick drum, something a little softer with a little bit of a hiss on top of it, because the 1975 are an indie pop band, but they do have like a lot of like hip hop inspired sounds in their sound design. It's actually pretty interesting. We then have our hi-hat, which has one knob pumper on it, so it's slightly changing the rhythm that it's playing. So if I take that off, like it's more like straight, like da 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 da. And so this quarter note sidechain, it sort of makes it ease up a little bit more. So it's like da da da. Makes it interesting. And then for this track, they didn't actually use a whole lot of snare. It's a lot of claps. So I just got like a couple of Leno claps. They're super vinyl-y, super pokey, but they have like a really short release on them, which gives that linear reverb a little bit more space to wash out. And then the final section is all of the sound effects stuff, which honestly adds so much to the beat, it's kind of ridiculous. So let's just work through all that we have. So George from the 1975 was obsessed with wind chimes as crashes for this record, because I've already replicated 2 other songs off of this album, and they also used like this weird wind chimey texture on the crash. But yeah, that's just something I noticed. Again, using clap impact. Really used Shep's Omnichannel to destroy it. I used a lot of harmonics. High passed it pretty heavily. So we have this little marimba thing at the end. And again, almost like those guitar layers, you're trying to almost fill in any random spots in the arrangement with just these like little hits, almost like ear candy. And then we have a lot of loops here. So let's just go through them one at a time. We have this guy. So to show you how much I'm manipulating these guys, let me turn off the processing for one of them. So pretty radical, again, using one knob pumper stuff to sort of not even just get it out of the way of the kick, but to like change the rhythm that it's playing. So, and then I just messed around with like a Lindell channel and just distorted the crap out of it. It basically just makes it really distorted and clacky. We then have a hand drum. We have another hand drum. We have that same distorted Lindell channel strip on this Oliver loop. We have another Oliver loop. And you can hear I'm using the pumpers pretty aggressively. I don't want these full loops coming out in the beat. I only want them on certain hits. And so what I'll do with a lot of these one knob pumper things, I'll set them to different lengths. So either a quarter or a half or even a whole sometimes. And then if I want to like swap up when certain elements are coming in or coming out, you can use this offset, which is honestly pretty effective at like making a loop sound really different than what it just sounds like out of the box. And then last loop is this percussion. So all of the sound effects and percussion together sound like this. It has this sort of like swing to it that like genuinely when you take them out, that swing kind of gets lost from the song. And then for my mastering chain, I can go into it a little bit. It's not fully what I'm using right now, just because the more I've gotten into developing my mastering chain, the less capable I am of showing you guys exactly what I'm using. I think what I'll do is on my next video, I'll show you an actual mastering session that I'm using as a template now. But then from that point on, I'll probably just like not show mastering stuff, because also I'm a producing channel. But yeah, I'm just using a lot of RC20 on the master, specifically because I wanted to degrade the mix to sound more like what the 1975 have their mixes sounding like. They're not clean, they're not modern, they're very indie pop, they're very drivey, they're darker, they're a bit grittier. And I know that throwing RC20 on the master bus sounds like a terrible decision, but every time I take it off and I'm doing these 1975 songs, it just kind of doesn't sound right. So I'm using the Brainworks V3 dB. Basically, I'm just using stereo width to control how wide the song is, and then high passing the sides up to about 70 hertz just to make the low end cleaner. Whenever I'm doing like rock stuff or indie pop stuff, the mid-range builds up a lot more, so we have some linear phase multiband, just sort of taming snare hits, piano hits, just this general mid-range and keeping it from being hyper dynamic. We then have my new favorite plugin ever, which is the Kotelnikov compressor from TDR, doing like 1 dB of gain reduction at most, using some upward compression. I'm experimenting with a different plugin right now for upwards compression, but right now I'm just using MV2, and then some infinity EQ just to sort of tame the song to how I like it. Just before I was filming, I was using the Ozone Maximizer, but I recently just bought Pro L2, and yeah, I understand why everybody loves this now, because this is an awesome limiter, and it's probably going to be my normal go-to from this point on. But yeah, that is everything, so let's look at what the final song sounds like. But yeah, that is the final track. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did and you've gotten to this point, please hit subscribe and all those buttons below. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday, so if you enjoy this kind of stuff, this is basically all I do. Over here is a video that I've done that YouTube thinks that you would like. And yeah, I will see you guys next week.